Operation Shinki, Divine Turtle Operation Number 1, was the Japanese Midget submarine component of the larger Plan Z surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The Midget submarine operation was a relatively late add-on to the plan, approved by the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, during a planning conference on 11 to 13 October 1941 over the heated objections of the aviation planners, who believed the Midget submarine operation risked blowing the element of surprise for little gain. The aviators were right, except the U.S. command and control process at Pearl Harbor at the time could not react fast enough. On 19 October 1941, the commander of 6th Fleet Japan's submarine force issued orders to modify 5 Type C-1 submarines to each piggyback 1 modified Type A Midget submarine. The necessary modifications were complete by 10 November. The 5 Type C-1 submarines were new, large, long-range diesel-electric submarines. The Type A Midget submarine was a 2-man submersible of 46 tons submerged and 78 feet in length, armed with 2 Type 97 17.7-inch torpedoes with nearly 800-pound warheads. The Type A was powered by a battery-operated electric motor with a maximum speed of 23 knots surfaced and 19 knots submerged, a range of 80 nautical miles at 6 knots and 100 nautical miles at 2 knots, and a maximum depth of 100 feet. The 5 midgets selected for the mission were modified with a scuttling charge in addition to a unique figure-8-shaped net guard cutter, jump line, propeller guard, telephone connection to the mother submarine, and other engineering and battery upgrades, but at a cost of reducing maximum speed to 16 knots. Range at slow speed was essentially unchanged. Of note, even though there would eventually be 46 Type A midgets constructed, the net guard cutter configuration on the 5 Pearl Harbor boats was a unique identifier. Many accounts use different means to identify each of the 5 midget submarines. Although the midgets had numbers, the Japanese at the time generally identified them by the mother submarine. For example, I-16 means I-16's boat. Other accounts use an HA series identifier, although this system was created after the war. Still other accounts use the name of the midget's pilot. Others use the mother boat, followed by an A such as I-16A. The midget sunk by Ward DD-139 is often referred to as the Ward Midget. This gets very confusing in various accounts. On 22 October, the Japanese passenger liner Taiyo Maru departed Yokohama for Honolulu, ordered unknowingly to follow a track that would be used by the Japanese carrier strike force, the Kido Butai. Aboard Taiyo Maru were 3 Japanese naval officers disguised as crewmen, one of whom was midget submarine pilot Lieutenant Matsuo Keiyu, whose mission was to observe the approaches to Pearl Harbor. Taiyo Maru arrived in Honolulu on 1 November 1941 and departed on 3 November, returning to Japan on 17 November. Just in time to provide an extensive intelligence briefing on Pearl Harbor's defenses to the midget officer pilots and other senior personnel and planners. The officers of the Special Attack Unit were briefed that their mission was to occur only if it was determined that the majority of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was in Pearl Harbor. They were to enter the harbor only if they could do so covertly, and once in the harbor they were to lie low and conduct their attack in the lull between the 2 waves of the Japanese airstrike. If they survived the attack, the midget submarines were to rendezvous with their mother submarines off the island of Lanai. 2 other submarines, I-68 and I-69, were assigned to go into the launch area after the attack as an additional means to attempt a rescue of survivors. The enlisted crewmen were only read in on the plan after the mother submarines were underway. Of note, only 2 of the 10 crewmen were actually volunteers. The rest had been assigned to the midgets as part of routine rotation. On 18 November, the Special Attack Unit, commanded by Rear Admiral Sasaki Hanku, departed Kure, Japan, making a direct transit to Oahu but steering 600 nautical miles clear of Wake Island and Midway Island to avoid U.S. patrol aircraft searches. Roughly concurrent with the Special Attack Unit's transit, 20 other Japanese submarines were en route to Hawaii and would converge in sectors around Oahu prior to the attack. Meanwhile, 3 other submarines would scout the track ahead of the carrier strike force and then provide a barrier and rescue force just south of the carrier's launch position. Japanese submarines, plus 5 midgets, would converge on Oahu the day before the air attack. On 2 December, the Special Attack Unit and the rest of the strike force received the code word message, "Climb Mount Niitaka," signaling that the attack was a go for 8 December, Tokyo time, 7 December, Pearl Harbor time. The Special Attack Unit arrived off the entrance to Pearl Harbor under cover of darkness on December 6, 1941. Each submarine was assigned an operating sector, with 2 submarines in an inner sector within about 7 nautical miles of the entrance. In the outer ring, I-24 was to the southwest, I-22 to the south, and I-18 to the southeast. The launch sequence commenced after midnight, sometimes complicated by the Midgets, which turned out to have many problems, most notably depth control, between 12:42 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. on December 7th. The motherships launched their 5 Midget subs. HA-19 immediately encountered serious depth control problems and began to broach. Later, the gyro compass would malfunction, and Sakamaki would have to spend an inordinate amount of time with his periscope up, attempting to navigate. With the exception of the account by Sakamaki, who was the only survivor, there is no positive identification of which midget did what, but based on locations and timing, educated guesses are possible. Sunrise on 7 December was at 6:24, but as the sun was blocked by Oahu's mountains and clouds, the midget operating area remained relatively dark until about 7 a.m. To get into Pearl Harbor, the midgets would have to first get through the defensive sea area, a 10-square-mile area of constantly patrolled, restricted water space, and then through the anti-submarine and torpedo boom barrier with nets that blocked the channel. The midgets were under orders not to attempt to force their way through the boom, lest they give away the surprise, so the only way in was to trail another ship that was entering the harbor while the boom was open. The Inshore Patrol Command, subordinate to the 14th Naval District, was responsible for patrolling the area. The commander of that naval district was Rear Admiral Claude Bloch, who reported to the Chief of Naval Operations but coordinated with the Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Fleet and Pacific Fleet, Admiral Husband Kimmel. The 14th Naval District, which included all of Hawaii, was responsible for the defense of the fleet when it was in port, as well as coordinating with the U.S. Army, which was responsible for the air defense of the islands. The Naval District, in coordination with the fleet, was responsible for long-range surveillance by Navy patrol aircraft. Of note, Rear Admiral Bloch had previously been the 4-star Sincus from 1930 to 1940 before reverting to his permanent 2-star rank and taking the 14th Naval District assignment. It was not unusual in the interwar period for the very few 4- and 3-star admirals to take 2-star jobs afterward if they had not yet met the mandatory retirement age. The Inshore Patrol Command included several minesweepers and 4 World War I vintage destroyers. The destroyers would rotate duty, patrolling the approaches to Pearl Harbor for a week at a time. The minesweepers would sweep for mines, and the destroyers would challenge and identify any vessels entering the defensive sea area and turn away any vessels that were not authorized. U.S. submarines were supposed to only transit the area on the surface and under positive escort by a surface ship. The 27 November top-secret war warning message from Washington mentioned impending Japanese operations in Asia and that the Japanese could attack in any direction, specifying Guam and other locations in Asia, but not mentioning Pearl Harbor. In response, Admiral Kimmel issued new, more liberal rules of engagement. Any submerged submarine in the defensive sea area was to be immediately attacked with no need to secure permission from higher authority. Also, any active submarine prosecution radio transmissions were to be conducted in clear voice not coded on a frequency specifically established for the purpose, and with 24-hour communications watches established. Kimmel unilaterally implemented these new orders without consulting with Washington. Kimmel believed that any air attack on Pearl Harbor would be preceded by submarine activity, and he was deeply concerned about the vulnerability to both air and submarine attacks. However, raising concerns about the vulnerability of the fleet and that the fleet's presence was a provocation, not a deterrent to the Japanese, had gotten Kimmel's predecessor, Admiral James O. Richardson, fired by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. On the night of 6th to 7th December, the 2 minesweepers Condor and Crossbill were conducting routine minesweeping just outside the channel, while the duty patrol destroyer Ward was operating a little farther out. Although the war warning message had extremely limited distribution, the officers in general had a very acute understanding of the high level of tension with Japan and held the widespread belief that war was imminent but expected to commence in Asia. Wicks-class destroyer Ward was one of about 200 flush deck or 4 Piper destroyers rushed into production when the United States entered World War I because the Navy needed convoy escorts to counter the serious German U-boat threat. Built at Mare Island Naval Shipyard, Ward set records with a construction period of less than a month. Her keel was laid on 15th of May, 1918. She was commissioned on 24 June 1918 and transferred to the Atlantic. With the end of the war in November 1918, the United States suddenly had a glut of destroyers. After serving as a beacon ship and a plane guard for the historic crossing of the Atlantic by the U.S. Navy NC-4 flying boat in 1919, Ward was put into reserve in San Diego and decommissioned on 21 July 1921. In anticipation of the outbreak of war, Ward was recommissioned on 15 January 1941. Except for officers and senior enlisted, most of her crew consisted of 85 naval reservists from Minnesota. Their unit was called up on 21 January 1941 and reported for duty 2 days later. They were shipped by train to San Diego, where Ward was conducting workups in February before transferring to Pearl Harbor. Although old, Ward had a very respectable top speed of 35 knots. The ship was 1,000 tons standard displacement and 310 feet long. Her main armament was 4 4-inch 50 caliber guns, 1 forward, 2 amidships, 1 on each side, and 1 aft. Her woefully inadequate anti-aircraft armament was 1 3-inch 23 caliber gun and 2 50 caliber machine guns. She also had 4 triple 21-inch torpedo mounts, 2 per side, 2 depth charge racks on the stern, and 1 Y-gun depth charge thrower. Her designed complement was 131 8 officers, 10 senior enlisted, and 113 junior enlisted. However, on 7 December, she was undermanned like every other ship at Pearl Harbor. Ward had gotten underway at 6:30 a.m. on 6 December after a change of command on 5 December. Ward was the first command for Lieutenant William W. Outerbridge. Outerbridge had been in the Navy for 14 years. Promotions were slow then, and had served on 7 ships, including 3 years on the Asiatic Station aboard heavy cruiser Augusta CA-31 from 1937 to 1940. Under a heavy cloud cover and waning moon, Condor and Crossbill slowly plied back and forth across the entrance to the channel. At 3:42, Condor's officer of the deck, Ensign Russell G. McCoy, spotted a suspicious phosphorescent wake 50 yards ahead on the port bow. After having Quartermaster R.C. Utrick and Seaman First Class R.B. Chaves lay eyes on the wake as well, Russell determined that a periscope was causing it, along with what appeared to be the conning tower of a small submarine, something none of them had ever seen before. Regardless, whatever it was not supposed to be there. Condor made a turn to avoid the object, and the submarine turned away as well. At 3:57, Condor sent a message to Ward via yardarm blinker and clear voice radio, sighted submerged submarine on westerly course, speed 9 knots. The transmission was monitored by the naval radio station at Bishop's Point. The communications watch had only recently gone to 24 hours every day. It should also have been monitored by the 14th Naval District. Communications watch? Except the lieutenant on watch was asleep. Ward's officer of the deck, Lieutenant Oscar Gepner, also Ward's gunnery officer, immediately called for Outerbridge, who ordered the crew to general quarters at 4:08 a.m. Over the next few minutes, there was a series of clear voice radio exchanges of information between the two ships, a critical one being Condor's report that the submarine contact was only 1,000 yards from the channel entrance, was heading toward the entrance, and had been last spotted at 3:50. Ward searched the area visually and with sonar but gained no contact. After a fruitless search, Ward contacted Condor at 4:30 for any update, and Condor replied negative. Ward secured from general quarters at 4:35, although she continued to search. Bishop's Point monitored and logged the communications, and other stations on the island should have heard them as well on the recently established dedicated frequency set up for submarine prosecutions in the defensive sea area. However, neither Condor nor Ward made a specific report to the 14th Naval District, as there had been multiple submarine reports in the preceding weeks, all of which had turned out to be false or could not be verified. The Bishop's Point duty officer assumed this was just another false alarm since Ward had failed to find anything. The duty officer made no specific report to the 14th Naval District, also assuming the Naval District Communications Watch had been monitoring as well. At 4:58, the anti-submarine net boom was opened to allow the 2 minesweepers to return to Pearl Harbor, and Crossbill went in first at 5:08 with Condor. As opening and closing the barrier was time-consuming, standard procedure was to leave it open if other ships were expected to transit, and the general cargo ship Antares was due in at 6. As it turned out, Antares did not enter Pearl Harbor at all on 7 December, although the barrier remained open waiting for her, leaving the channel wide open for the Midget subs to get through, if they could navigate their way there in the dark. At 5:30, the two Japanese heavy cruisers escorting the carrier strike force each catapulted an Aichi-Jake floatplane from over 200 nautical miles north of Oahu. The mission of the plane from Tonai was to observe the Lahaina anchorage off Maui, discreetly to verify previous Japanese intelligence reports that it was no longer routinely in use. Lahaina had frequently been used as a fleet anchorage because getting in and out of Pearl Harbor was a pain. But Kimmel was concerned about the extreme vulnerability of the unprotected and deep-water anchorage to submarine attack, and it was rarely used in 1941. The Japanese were hoping U.S. ships would be there and had a branch plan ready if any were, because any ship sunk at Lahaina was not going to be raised afterwards. Tonai's Jake verified the intelligence that the anchorage was empty. Chikuma's plane circled wide around Oahu to disguise its true direction of origin before making a very accurate reconnaissance of the harbor. The Jake was tracked by U.S. Army radar, but was not recognized or reported as a threat. Both planes were directed not to report their findings until after the first carrier strike wave launched, to preclude radio intercept. Chikuma's plane also verified recent Japanese intelligence reporting that no carriers were in port. At 6:05, the 6 Japanese carriers commenced launching defensive combat air patrol, immediately followed by the first strike wave. By 6:15, a 183-plane strike, led by Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, was en route to Pearl Harbor. Also at 6:05, Ward gained her first visual on Antares and made identification via flashing light. Antares was an 11,000-ton general cargo ship commanded by Commander Lawrence C. Grannis that also served as the flagship. For Training Squadron 8, Antares had departed Pearl Harbor on 3 November 1941, with a 300-man Army Engineer Battalion embarked and arrived at Canton Island on 14 November. Antares had towed a 500-ton barge and 2 smaller barges, both of which foundered en route, with Army equipment to set up an airfield on Canton, intended to ferry Army and Air Force aircraft to Asia via a more southerly route, less exposed to possible Japanese interdiction than Wake Island and Guam. Canton Island was also jointly claimed by the United States and the United Kingdom. Antares had dropped the Army unit at Canton and then proceeded to Palmyra Island, where the U.S. Navy was building a facility. After a mix-up of barges, Antares had returned to Canton and picked up a different empty barge for the return transit to Pearl Harbor. On the return transit to Pearl Harbor, Antares was afforded escort by destroyer Selfridge. During the transit, there were multiple possible submarine sightings, and the crew of Antares believed they were being followed by a submarine. The southern group of Japanese submarines had arrived at Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands on 20 November, refueled and departed on 23 and 24 November en route to Pearl Harbor. So it is conceivable that one of these submarines could have crossed paths with Antares, but this has never been confirmed. Selfridge was actually running low on provisions, and as the group approached Oahu, Selfridge was given permission to proceed ahead and entered Pearl Harbor on 6 December. At 6:15, Patrol Squadron 14 commenced launching 3 PBY-5 Catalina flying boats from Naval Air Station Kaneohe with the mission to search the southern and westerly approaches to Pearl Harbor. Via communications traffic analysis, U.S. naval intelligence was aware of the buildup of Japanese submarines at Kwajalein southwest of Pearl, which was considered the most likely vector for a submarine attack and hence the focus of the search. Plus, the weather was lousy north of Oahu due to a thick cloud deck. At 6:30, Antares arrived off the entrance to Pearl Harbor at a rendezvous point to transfer the barge to a tug, about a mile outside the channel entrance. However, no tug was in sight. Antares commenced a slow turn to the east to mill about smartly, awaiting the tug. At this point, several things happened almost simultaneously. As Antares made the turn, lookouts spotted an object 1,500 yards on the starboard quarter, between Antares and the barge. Commander Grannis quickly assessed this as a submarine, even though he had never seen one like it before. At 6:37, Antares transmitted a radio message in the clear to Ward, monitored by Bishop's Point. A partially submerged submarine spotted 1,500 yards off starboard quarter seems to be having depth control trouble, trying to go down. Ward responded, "Roger Antares, stand by." At this point, Ward's helmsman, Seaman Second Class Herbert Reubig, spotted the object behind Antares, which was about a mile away, and pointed it out to the quartermaster of the watch, Seaman Second Class Donald Gruning, who looked through binoculars, thought it looked like a small submarine conning tower, and notified the officer of the watch, Lieutenant Gopner. Gepner initially assessed it as a buoy, although he quickly changed his mind as the object appeared to be making way. Gupner summoned Outerbridge, who quickly appeared on the bridge dressed in pajamas and a Japanese kimono. Ward responded to Antares's call, "We have visual." At 6:40, Outerbridge ordered general quarters and Ward's crew went to their battle stations for the second time. As Antares and Ward were exchanging calls, the sharp-eyed co-pilot of one of the recently launched VP-14 PBY Catalina flying boats, Ensign Robert B. Clark, spotted the submarine. The pilot, Ensign William P. Tanner, was initially reluctant to believe it was a submarine and then assumed it must be a U.S. submarine in distress. Tanner made a low pass, and the plane dropped 2 smoke floats to mark the sub's location. Outerbridge ordered, "All ahead full," and Ward jumped from 5 to 25 knots on a course of 125 degrees true. Outerbridge considered ramming the sub, but then thought better of it, as submarine steel was tougher than thin-skinned World War I-era destroyers. By 6:45, Ward had closed within 300 yards, with the submarine on a reciprocal course. The 2 vessels would pass starboard to starboard at a combined rate of speed. The submarine gave no indication it was aware of Ward bearing down on it. Outerbridge gave the order to fire, and at a range of about 100 yards. The forward 4-inch gun number 1 on the bow fired 1 round that passed just over the submarine conning tower and hit the water some distance beyond. As the submarine passed down Ward's side, the starboard side 4-inch gun number 3 was able to get off 1 shot before its arc of fire was fouled at the near point-blank range of 50 yards. Ward's report, repeated in many sources, says 560 yards, but that makes no sense and is presumably a typo for 50 or 60 yards. Too close to fuse, the shell did not detonate, but nevertheless was a direct hit at the base of the conning tower, witnessed by many crewmen on Ward. Ward veered to starboard as the submarine rolled to starboard. Outerbridge ordered an immediate depth charge attack as the submarine passed astern, and with 4 blasts of the ship's whistle as a signal. 4 Ashkin's depth charges, set for a 100-foot depth, were rolled off the stern racks and appeared to detonate under the submarine. The submarine rolled over, went down, and never came back up. Seeing Ward attacking the sub, Ensign Tanner and the PBY then made 2 passes, dropping a depth charge each time on the submarine datum. By 6:47, the attack was over. At 6:51, Outerbridge made a clear-voice radio transmission to the 14th Naval District Watch. "We have dropped depth charges upon sub operating in defensive sea area." Outerbridge immediately realized that the transmission did not adequately reflect the confidence that Ward had attacked a genuine submarine. Ships had dropped depth charges on contacts in the area before with no confirmation of an actual submarine. Firing on a submarine was something new and different. At 6:53, Outerbridge sent the following message, acknowledged and logged by Bishop's Point, USS Ward to Com 14. Have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon unidentified submarine operating in defensive sea area with a direct hit from our number 3 gun on his conning tower, followed up with 4 ash cans. Oil slick 300 yards astern visible on surface, Lieutenant William W. Outerbridge, CO USS Ward. This series of messages woke up the 14th Naval District's Communications Watch Officer. Immediately after the attack on the Midget submarine, a white Japanese-style sampan was observed by Antares at 6:48, only 500 yards away, intruding into the defensive sea area, and Ward proceeded to investigate while still in the process of transmitting messages on the attack on the submarine. The sampan initially disregarded bullhorn orders to stop, until Outerbridge had his gunner's mates put a few rounds of rifle fire across the bow of the sampan, causing the sampan's master to wave a white flag and come to a halt. Ward then radioed to the Coast Guard to have a cutter come out and escort the sampan away. This transmission resulted in confusion, as some officers in the chain of command, attempting to assess the validity of Ward's attack messages, made the assumption that if Ward was off chasing some sampan, then the submarine reports couldn't have been all that serious. Rear Admiral Edwin Layton, Pacific Fleet No. 2, would later criticize Outerbridge for not filing a detailed report, and much time would be lost in the notification process that followed as officers asked for confirmation. Which results in the following question: was Outerbridge's entire message passed up the chain, or just the first part that appears in almost every source? Ensign Tanner's PBY also noted the oil slick, and at 7 a.m. sent a coded message to Commander Task Force 3 and Commander Patrol Wing 1. Tanner's message should have been sent in the clear by the new row. Pat Wing 1 quickly acknowledged, but TF3 did not until 7:15, requesting confirmation. Tanner responded in the clear, "Sunk one enemy sub 1 mile south of Pearl Harbor." At 7 a.m., IA-24 headed for the Pearl Harbor entrance, but could not get there before the air attack commenced. Sakamaki would later claim he sighted Ward and could have attacked, but was saving his torpedoes for bigger warships. The other Midget submarines were presumably in the area near the entrance to the Pearl Harbor Channel at the time of Ward's attack. At 7 a.m., Admiral Kimmel woke up. At 7:02, the Army radar station at Opana at the northern tip of Oahu detected the inbound Japanese airstrike. The Army then suffered their own command, control, and communications breakdown. At about the same time, the 6 Japanese carriers were launching the second wave of 167 planes. At 7:03, Ward gained sound contact on another submarine, commenced an attack run at 7:05, and dropped more depth charges at 7:06. Ward then sighted a black oil bubble 300 yards astern. Communications regarding this attack are not available. Ward would make several more depth charge attacks on submarine contacts during the day, expending a total of 172 depth charges. As the transmissions from Ward were received, the 14th Naval District Communications Watch Officer hurried to pass the information verbally to the 14th District Duty Officer, Lieutenant Commander Harold Kaminsky. Kaminsky tried to call Rear Admiral Block's aide but could not get through. Kaminsky then called the Fleet Duty Officer, reaching the Assistant Fleet Duty Officer, Lieutenant Commander R.B. Black, and passing the report to him. Black reached the Fleet Duty Officer, Commander Vince Murphy. Murphy was the Assistant Fleet War Plans Officer, and had in his possession the plan completed the day before for the disposition of the fleet in the event of a declaration of war or a surprise attack. Murphy directed Black to call Kaminsky back to get more information while Murphy got dressed to come into the fleet headquarters, but Black couldn't get through. Concurrently, Kaminsky was able to reach the 14th Naval District Chief of Staff, Captain John B. Earl. Earl asked for more information but directed Kaminsky to have the duty destroyer Monaghan DD-354 get underway and investigate, although it would take Monaghan at least 45 minutes to get up steam. Earl was then able to reach the commander of the 14th Naval District, Rear Admiral Claude Bloch, at 7:12, and the two discussed the report, both inclined to believe it another false report, but both taking it seriously. Bloch concurred with getting the duty destroyer underway. When Fleet Duty Officer Murphy reached headquarters, he immediately received a call from Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey of Patrol Wing 2, advising of a call from the Ford Island Duty Officer, the Ford Island Operations. Center tracked the PBY patrols, among other things Lieutenant Dick Ballinger, reporting that one of the PBYs had sunk a submerged submarine 1 mile off the entrance to Pearl Harbor. Murphy replied that they received the same sort of message from one of the commanding officers of the D&Ds on inshore patrol. As soon as Murphy and Ramsey ended their call, Kaminsky got through to Murphy with a report of Ward's action, most of which Murphy now knew. Murphy called Admiral Kimmel, who had arisen at 7 a.m. for a golf match scheduled at 9 with Lieutenant General Walter Short, commander of U.S. Army forces in Hawaii. Kimmel said he would cancel the golf match and come in. At this point, there are numerous conflicting accounts, including in official testimony, of who told whom what and when. Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison wrote that Kaminsky did not receive Ward's report until 7:12 due to a delay in decoding the message by a not-too-bright yeoman. Kaminsky's testimony just says the duty yeoman was not trained. However, this is probably conflated with the PBY's first report, which was coded, and not Ward's transmissions, which were sent in the clear. The entire notification and assessment process was plagued by busy signals as the telephone exchanges jammed, since what is listed above is probably just the tip of the iceberg. A number of simultaneous calls were being made among various headquarters and command centers in an attempt to assess the validity and implications of Ward's reports. These processes had actually been tested during previous exercises, which entailed additional manning and had worked reasonably well. However, on the night of 6-7 December, the C-3 architecture was not even at an exercise level of proficiency, let alone a wartime level. Two things stand out, however. From the telephone tag, it was all too late, and no one called the Army, which was responsible for the air defense of the island. Kimmel was waiting for his duty driver on his front lawn, where he had a clear view of the first bombs falling. He had just been on a call with Murphy that was interrupted by a yeoman reporting that an attack was underway. At 7:33, Tone A's scout plane radioed that the Lahaina anchorage was empty. At 7:35, Chikuma's scout plane reported no carriers, 9 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 6 light cruisers were in port. Actually, there were 8 battleships, plus ex-battleship Utah, AG-16, 2 heavy cruisers, and 6 light cruisers, making the Chikuma Scouts report one of the more accurate by either side during the war. The scout plane's reports were relayed to the Japanese strike leader, Commander Fuchida. The Chikuma Scouts' report of clear weather over the target was a relief to Fuchida, who was worried the strike would overshoot Oahu due to the cloud deck north of the island. The cloud cover parted as the strike reached the northern tip of Oahu at 7:40 and commenced a transit down the west side of the island. At 7:51, the duty destroyer Monaghan received orders to get underway and investigate Ward's contact. At about 8 a.m., things began to go from bad to worse for I-24 when the Midget ran aground east of the harbor entrance, damaging the lower torpedo tube and other parts of the Midget. At 8:17, the destroyer helm DD-388 exited the harbor, sighted a Midget submarine hung up on a reef east of the exit, and opened fire, but missed. Sakamaki said he was fired on by a destroyer about this time, so his Midget was probably the one helm shot at. Sakamaki was able to extricate the Midget off the reef in the nick of time. However, by then the gyro was completely useless. Chlorine gas knocked Sakamaki and his crewmen unconscious, and the Midget drifted east along the south shore of Oahu. Sakamaki periodically regained consciousness, observing smoke rising from Pearl Harbor and that his Midget was depth-charged several times. At 8:30, destroyer Monaghan was transiting southwesterly on the west side of Ford Island with the intent of exiting the harbor during what turned out to be the short lull between the 2 waves of attacks. At that point, destroyer minesweeper Zane DMS-14 reported sighting a submarine 200 yards astern of repair ship Medusa R1, anchored at the entrance to Middle Lock, west of Ford Island. Shortly thereafter, minesweeper Breese DM-18 and seaplane tender Curtis A-4 sighted the sub and opened fire. At 8:37, Monaghan sighted the conning tower of the submarine 1,200 yards off her starboard bow. Monaghan's skipper, Lieutenant Commander William P. Burford, ordered flank speed with intent to ram. At this point, the submarine was under heavy fire from multiple ships, but nevertheless fired a torpedo at Curtis that missed and hit a dock in Pearl City. In turn, Curtis hit the conning tower of the submarine with a 5-inch shell, assessed to have decapitated the pilot. Nevertheless, the submarine turned and fired a torpedo at the onrushing Monaghan that narrowly missed, probably too close to arm anyway, and hit Ford Island. Morrison says it detonated. Although some of the aerial torpedoes launched at ships on the west side of Ford Island buried themselves in the mud. Regardless, Monaghan crunched over the submarine, forcing it to the 30-foot bottom, and dropped 2 depth charges to complete the kill. After the ram of the submarine, Monaghan was momentarily out of control and scraped along a derrick barge, then fired another shot at another submarine that turned out to be a black harbor buoy, just as the second wave attack commenced. Lieutenant Commander Burford was awarded a Navy Cross for the action. The Midget submarine sank by Monaghan was raised 2 weeks after the attack. It was so badly battered and filled with chlorine gas that it was never entered by some accounts, which actually wasn't necessary since I-24 was captured mostly intact. At some point, the Midget was used as fill for the S-1 submarine dock. Accounts vary on what happened to the bodies of the crew, with some indicating they remained in the sub, others that the personnel compartment was cut out and separately buried with the crew, and yet another that a naval intelligence officer did get into the Midget and push out the 2 bodies, which were later buried at the Nuuanu Cemetery in Honolulu, and a lieutenant's shoulder patch was recovered and returned to Japan in 1946. This Midget was rediscovered in 1952, but reburied in the same place. Monaghan's Midget is generally assessed to be I-22, commanded by Lieutenant Iwasa. Iwasa was the most senior and experienced of the Midget pilots, which might have made it more likely that he would be the one to gain access to the harbor. In addition, a lieutenant's dress blue uniform sleeve was found floating in the harbor, and he was the only one with that rank in the Midget force. Some historians have postulated that the sleeve could be from an aviator. One crashed into Curtis in the second wave attack. However, it is unlikely an aviator would be in dress blue, but perfectly plausible that a Midget pilot on a probable suicide mission would get dressed up. At 10:04 on 7 December, after the air attack ended, the light cruiser St. Louis CL-49 came barreling out of the Pearl Harbor entrance at 25 knots. Under the command of Captain George Arood, St. Louis was the first major ship to exit the harbor. As she passed the first entrance buoy, St. Louis lookouts sighted 2 torpedoes at 2,000 yards inbound on her starboard beam. The torpedoes may very well have hit St. Louis, had they not hit a reef first. St. Louis fired on and claimed to hit the submarine's conning tower, although some have postulated the target was floating minesweeping gear. The submarine that fired these torpedoes is unknown, but the most likely candidate is I-16 commanded by Yokoyama, which would have approached from the southwest sector and possibly taken up station there after being unable to enter the harbor when it was still dark. At 10:41 p.m., I-16 received a radio message, CC short for success 3 times. I-16 assessed the transmission as being from her own Midget, although there is no way to confirm that. At 12:51 a.m. on 8 December, I-16 received another transmission, unable to navigate, which was the last heard from any Midget. Meanwhile, I-24, commanded by Sakamaki, drifted east along the south shore of Oahu, then around the southeast point before washing ashore at Waimanalo Beach, near Bellows Field. After finally coming to, Sakamaki set the scuttling charge, and then he and Chief Warrant Officer Inagaki abandoned the boat. Sakamaki made it ashore, but Inagaki had his head bashed in and drowned. The scuttling charge failed to go off. Sakamaki ran up and down the beach until he was captured, becoming prisoner of war number 1, resulting in him being erased from Japanese wartime accounts of the operation, even from the famous painting of the 9 hero gods. In truth, Operation Shinki was a total failure, and almost ruined the element of surprise, as the aviators had predicted. However, Japanese propaganda gave the Midgets credit for sinking Arizona, to the considerable consternation of the Japanese aviators. Sakamaki's Midget, with both torpedoes still in the tube, was salvaged, repaired with parts from the Monahan Midget, extensively studied for intelligence value, and taken on war bond drives around the United States. It is now on display in the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, which happened to be Admiral Chester Nimitz's hometown. After I-18, commanded by Lieutenant Furuno, was launched, there is no confirmed record of what became of her during the Pearl Harbor attack. Although it is quite likely she was the subject of one of the many depth charge attacks by Ward and other destroyers as they exited the harbor. However, in 1960, a Pearl Harbor configured Type A Midget submarine was found by a Navy diver in 75 feet of water in Keehee Lagoon, southeast of the Pearl Harbor entrance, and subsequently raised by current. Before the expansion of Honolulu International Airport, Keehee Lagoon was connected to the sea. The Midget was relatively undamaged outwardly, but with definite interior signs of being battered by depth charges. The Midget had the distinctive figure 8 net guard cutter, and both torpedoes were still in the tubes. The conning tower hatch was open, with no sign of the crew except stray shoes and some clothing. How the Midget came to be in Keehee Lagoon is unknown, but the discovery accounted for 6 of the 10 torpedoes of the Midget force, and it definitely is one of the Pearl Harbor Midgets. The Midget was returned to Japan, where it was restored with fabricated parts, and is located at the Naval Tactical School in Etajima. In July 1992, the Pisces 5 deep submersible vehicle of the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory located the aft section of a Type A Midget in 1,200 feet of water. The aft section was found in the defensive sea area off Pearl Harbor, in an area extensively previously used for dumping all manner of military equipment. It was originally assessed as a Midget captured from elsewhere in the Pacific, studied, and then dumped. However, in September 2000s, the Pisces 5 located the midsection of a Type A Midget in roughly the same area as the stern, with some damage suggesting a scuttling charge had been used, and that the midsection had at some point been towed and dumped. In November 2000s, explorer Bob Ballard located what turned out to be the same midsection. In August 2001, the Pisces 4 was on the way to relook at the midsection when it stumbled across the bow of a Type A Midget with the distinctive net guard cutter and both torpedo tubes empty. The stern section, found 9 years earlier, was rediscovered nearby. This was definitely a Pearl Harbor Midget, and the evidence suggested that it had been scuttled with a charge and then raised, towed, and dumped at some later date. The sub was clearly cut into 3 pieces, except for a missing chunk where the scuttling charge would have been, leading to years of speculation as to how and when it got to where it was found. Then in 2002, the Hurls Pisces 4 and Pisces 5 discovered a Midget submarine in 1,312 feet of water about 5 miles outside the entrance to Pearl Harbor, but significantly outside the defensive sea area to the east, which is why it eluded discovery for so long. The submarine was definitely a Type A Midget, with the unique Pearl Harbor net guard cutter configuration, both torpedoes still in the tubes accounting for 8 of the 10 torpedoes, and a 4-inch hole on the starboard side at the base of the conning tower, exactly where Ward's gunners said they hit the Midget on 7 December, after enduring years of doubters questioning whether their gunnery could have really been that good, especially since they were just a bunch of reservists. Trying to account for the location of the Ward Midget was a problem, since it is about 1.5 miles from where Ward reported the sinking. Analysis suggests that Ward's shell, which didn't detonate, penetrated the hull but was deflected downward and out the bottom, enabling water pressure to force the air out of the relatively small hole, and with the configuration of the control surfaces, resulting in a slow sink rate and long glide before reaching the bottom. Although there is no way to confirm a hole in the bottom, the evidence fits the theory pretty well. Most analysts believe the Ward Midget is I-20, piloted by Ensign Hiru Akira, with Petty Officer 2nd Class Katayama Yoshio. Given the time and location of launch, and the time and location of Ward's attack, this assessment seems reasonable. So with the discovery of the Ward Midget and the 3-piece Midget, all 5 Midget submarines are accounted for, and assuming St. Louis's report of 2 torpedoes inbound is correct, all 10 torpedoes are accounted for. So only 1 Midget made it into Pearl Harbor. Case closed. Probably, but not so fast. Speculation that a second Midget submarine made it into Pearl Harbor and fired on Battleship Row possibly began with none other than the esteemed naval historian Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, who wrote that at least 1 Midget succeeded in entering the harbor due to the anti-torpedo barrier at the entrance to the harbor being inexplicably left open until 8:40. Later, Lieutenant Commander Layton, a U.S. Fleet intelligence officer, wrote that at least 2 Midgets entered the harbor. In addition, the U.S. Pacific Fleet Action Report, February 15, 1942, mentioned the recovery of an unexploded torpedo with a warhead of 1,000-pound high explosive in a section of the report that clearly associates the find with torpedo strikes on Battleship Row, so it is unlikely that this would have been a Monaghan Midget Type 97 torpedo that didn't explode. The Type 91 aerial torpedo came in several versions with differently sized warheads. Those used at Pearl Harbor were the Mod 2 with a smaller 449-pound warhead. These torpedoes were specially made for the Pearl Harbor attack and were in short supply. Other versions of the Type 91 had warheads as large as 713 pounds but well short of 1,000 pounds. Even the Midget subs Type 91 torpedoes had warheads that were 722 pounds. The 1,000-pound warhead report may not be accurate, but certainly suggests a big torpedo. Some analysis also suggests that one of the many torpedoes that hit Battleship Oklahoma caused damage consistent with a torpedo bigger than an aerial version. However, given how many torpedoes hit Oklahoma, at least 5, the Japanese claimed 9, and the number is probably somewhere in between, including when she was already capsizing. I don't know if that analysis is completely convincing. Much of the possible evidence of a Midget sub-attack on Battleship Row is in one of the most famous photos of the battle hiding in plain sight. The photo was taken by a Japanese rear seat gunner in a torpedo bomber just north of Ford Island, looking back out over Battleship Row and up the southeast loch. In the photo, West Virginia, Oklahoma, and California have already been hit by torpedoes, with shock waves radiating and oil gushing. More torpedo wakes are visible, and Arizona hasn't blown up yet. Right in the middle of the photo is a black speck, roughly consistent with the size of a Midget submarine conning tower and what might be interpreted as spray from the propellers of a small porpoising submarine having difficulty with depth control to be expected after firing 2 heavy torpedoes. Most historians and analysts dismiss the black speck and possible spray as film anomalies, smudges, a loose buoy, or even anti-aircraft fire, and note that the rooster tails cast no shadow. This may very well be true, but would be more convincing if the black speck and spray were not exactly where one would expect a Midget submarine to be while trying to take a shot on Battleship Row. Mitigating against that, however, is that, according to the plan, the Midget was not supposed to be launching torpedoes right at the height of the aerial torpedo attack. Another data point is from Lauren Bruner, the second to last and badly burned Arizona survivor to make it off the ship. in discussion with medical personnel on hospital ship Solace A5. Brunner claimed a Japanese midget sub tarried right under Solace, confirmed by a Solace diver, which prompted the commanding officer of Solace to move the ship. Hiding under a hospital ship would seem like a rather smart move, since the Japanese did not attack it. At that time, Brunner was in and out of morphine-induced hallucinations, so his recollection may be suspect. However, the log of the battleship Maryland BB-46 records that at 10:51 Solace reported sighting a submarine. Solace's action report does not mention a sighting, however. So, the alternative scenario is that a second midget made it into the harbor, plausible given how long the gate was left open, and executed an attack on Battleship Row, with one torpedo hitting Oklahoma and the other an apparent dud. The midget then worked its way around the north side of Ford Island and under Solace, and eventually wound up in relatively isolated West Loch, where the crew made the last radio transmissions before scuttling the midget and themselves. The scuttled midget then remained on the bottom until the May 1944 West Loch disaster, a massive ammunition explosion that sank several tank landing ships LSTs, killed 163, and was one of the most tightly held secrets of the war, and for many years afterwards. This alternate theory postulates that the midget was scooped up along with other debris from the disaster, for which records were poorly kept. Even the casualty count from the West Loch explosion and fire is suspect, i.e., too low, and then dumped. Under this theory, the three-piece midget is the second midget that made it into the harbor. This theory, however, leaves unexplained the two torpedoes fired at St. Louis. That report seems pretty solid, but it wouldn't be the first or last time some phenomenon was mistaken for a torpedo wake. It also doesn't explain the Japanese body with a sword strapped to his back, i.e., probably not an aviator, that washed ashore on 12 December, just west of the Pearl Harbor entrance. In 1956, Naval Intelligence Officer Captain Roger Pineau, then working for Samuel Eliot Morison, and also the co-author of Rear Admiral Eddie Layton's autobiography, wrote a letter to a Life magazine writer that around 1950, a wreck of a midget submarine was located at the entrance to Pearl Harbor west of the Port Hand Sea buoy. By order of the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Fleet, that midget wreck was raised and dumped further out at sea past the 3-mile limit, approximately where the three-piece midget rests now. It is not inconceivable that that midget could have been raised from West Loch in 1945 and dumped, only to be found again in 1950. 51, then raised and dumped again, except that possible West Loch debris was originally dumped farther out and not right outside the harbor entrance. Assessing all the facts, I find the more plausible scenario to be that the three-piece midget, probably I-16 approaching from the southwest, never made it into the harbor. Instead, it waited outside to the southwest and fired both torpedoes at St. Louis as she exited the harbor, which hit the reef west of the entrance. Then, possibly depth-charged, unable to navigate, and running out of air, I-16 made the last radio transmissions before scuttling herself. The crew may have tried to save themselves. Although the mission had a low probability of survival, these were not kamikaze pilots. As intriguing as the Battleship Row midget scenario is, it is far more complex and requires more assumptions, and is therefore somewhat less plausible. Although I have to admit that the enlargement of the black speck in the photo sure looks a lot like a midget sub. I suspect that this historical controversy will continue. Lieutenant William Outerbridge was awarded a Navy Cross for his actions in command of Ward on the morning of December 7, 1941. In September 1942, in a routine change of command, recently promoted Lieutenant Commander Outerbridge was relieved of command of Ward. Outerbridge drove a desk in the office of the Chief of Naval Transportation in Washington, D.C., before being given a plum command, the newly commissioned Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, O'Brien, in June 1944, just in time for O'Brien to shell German positions on D-Day of the Normandy landings. After operations against the Germans, O'Brien and Outerbridge transferred to the Pacific. In the meantime, Ward was subsequently converted to a fast transport capable of carrying about 200 troops and redesignated APD-16 in February 1943. The 4-inch 50 caliber No. 3 gun, which fired the second shot that hit and sank the Japanese midget submarine, was removed from the ship during the conversion. Some accounts indicate the No. 1 gun remained on board, but other accounts I have recently seen, which seem more reliable, indicate that all 4 of the 4-inch guns were removed and replaced by more modern dual-purpose, anti-air and anti-surface 3-inch guns. The number 3 gun was preserved due to its historic significance, and as a result of an intense lobbying effort by the Minnesota congressional delegation, was loaned to the state of Minnesota, where most of the enlisted crew came from. It remains on outdoor display just west of the Veterans Service Building in St. Paul, Minnesota. What may have happened to the number 1 gun does not appear to be recorded. Ward earned 9 battle stars as a destroyer and fast transport during World War II. Her actions included the dangerous landing of Army Rangers on Dinigad Island at the entrance to Leyte Gulf, in rough seas and without air cover, in the opening move of the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. In December 1944, Ward carried Army troops from Leyte Gulf to Ormoc Bay on the opposite side of Leyte after the Army advance across Leyte bogged down. The 70-ship naval task force in Ormoc Bay came under concerted Japanese kamikaze suicide plane attack on December 7, 1944. Ward was hit by a kamikaze, a twin-engine Betty bomber off the Philippines. The commanding officer of Ward at the time was Lieutenant Richard Farwell, who as an ensign had been the assistant engineering officer under Outerbridge during the sinking of the Japanese Midget submarine at Pearl Harbor. He had been on board Ward ever since. With the fire out of control and no way to confirm whether the forward ammunition magazine had been flooded. If not, the ship was at risk of blowing up at any moment. Farwell ordered the crew to abandon ship, which they did reluctantly, but the ship did not sink. However, the task force commander, Rear Admiral Arthur Struble, who would later command the Incheon landings in the Korean War, decided that trying to tow the damaged ship a long way back to Leyte, under the continuing air attack, was too risky to other ships. So he gave the order to scuttle Ward with gunfire. The closest ship was O'Brien, still commanded by Commander Outerbridge, the former skipper of Ward. After the crew of Ward had been evacuated from the ship, amazingly with no loss of life given the severity of damage, Outerbridge gave the order to open fire on his former command, with Farwell at his side. The first salvo detonated the after magazine, and Ward blew up and sank. On 1 December 2017, the research vessel R.V. Petrel, owned by the late Paul Allen and under the direction of Mission Director Robert Kraft, located Ward at a depth of 700 feet and conducted detailed underwater survey, providing the data to Naval History and Heritage Command at no cost to the U.S. Navy. After a change of command, O'Brien was hit by a kamikaze off Okinawa on 27 March 1945. Although 50 men were killed and 76 wounded, the crew was able to save the badly damaged ship, which subsequently saw combat service in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, and was decommissioned in 1972.